I'm 97 years old, and for more than 50 years I've carried a secret no one would believe even if they begged me to prove it. Between 1973 and 1998, in the Himalayas of Nepal, I met the same Yeti at my lodge again and again, long enough for him to show me things about humanity I wish I didn't know. This is the truth I've avoided telling my entire life and why I can't hold it in anymore. My name is James Morrison. In 1973, I was 45 years old and freshly widowed. Sarah had died that spring from breast cancer, and I couldn't stand being in our flat in London anymore. Everything reminded me of her. The kitchen where she'd make tea every morning, the sitting room where we'd read together by the fire, even the wallpaper she'd picked out in '68. So I did what any broken man does. I ran away. I had a small inheritance from Sarah's family and some savings from my years working as an engineer. I used it to buy a small trekking lodge in the Langtang Valley of Nepal, about 40 kilometers north of Kathmandu. The previous owner, an aging Sherpa named Dorje, had built it back in the 50s. Nothing fancy, 2 small guest rooms, a main room with a wood-burning stove, a basic kitchen, and an outhouse. No electricity except a small generator, no telephone. It was exactly what I needed. I arrived in July of 1973, flying into Kathmandu and then trekking for 3 days to reach the lodge. My supplies were simple: tinned goods from the capital, kerosene lamps, some tools, a shortwave radio so I could catch the BBC World Service, and my cameras. The lodge sat in a small clearing surrounded by rhododendron forests and towering peaks that stretched up like cathedral spires. The nearest village was 12 kilometers away. For the first 2 months, I saw nothing unusual. I spent my days repairing the lodge's roof, learning basic Nepali from Dorje's old phrase book, and trying to figure out how to live with the silence. Sarah and I had been married for 23 years. The silence was like a physical weight. Then came September 17th, 1973. I remember the date because it was a Monday and the BBC had been covering the Billie Jean King tennis match the night before. I woke around dawn to a sound I'd never heard, a low, guttural mooning coming from somewhere near the stream, maybe 200 meters from the lodge. I grabbed my walking stick and went to investigate. The morning mist was thick, rolling through the trees like smoke. I followed the sound, my boots crunching on the forest floor, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a bear. It was lying on its side near the stream bank, partially hidden by ferns. But as I got closer, maybe 10 meters away, I realized this was no bear. The thing was massive, easily 2.1 meters tall even lying down, covered in thick reddish-brown hair. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and one of its legs was twisted at an unnatural angle. It saw me and tried to get up, but collapsed with a sound that was almost human, a groan of pain and frustration. That's when I got my first clear look at its face. I've thought about that moment every day for 52 years. The face wasn't quite ape, wasn't quite human. The eyes were deep set and dark with an intelligence that froze me in place. It wasn't looking at me like an animal looks at a potential threat. It was studying me, calculating, deciding what I was gonna do. My walking stick was raised defensively. This was 1973. There wasn't any internet, no nature documentaries readily available. I knew about the Yeti from Sherpa stories,
Had heard tales from Tenzing Norgay's expedition accounts, but most Westerners thought it was folklore. Standing there looking at this creature bleeding onto the moss, I knew the Sherpa had been telling the truth. The creature made a sound, not aggressive, more like a question. It gestured weakly toward its injured leg with one massive hand. 5 fingers, I noted, long, thick fingers that could probably crush my skull without effort. I lowered my stick. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the loneliness. Maybe it was something in those eyes. But I went back to the lodge, grabbed my first aid kit and some old towels, and returned to the stream. The creature watched me approach, its breath coming in short, painful gasps. I'm no doctor, but I'd seen enough injuries during the war to know a bad break when I saw one. The lower leg bone, I think the tibia, was fractured, probably from a fall on the steep terrain. I had no way to set it properly, but I could clean the wound and try to stabilize it. For the next hour, I worked while this 2-meter creature lay perfectly still, allowing me to touch it. Its hair was coarser than I expected, more like thick wire than fur. The skin underneath was dark gray, almost black. When I poured antiseptic on the wound, it growled low in its throat, but didn't pull away. I used 2 straight branches and some rope to make a crude splint, wrapping it as tight as I dared. The creature watched my hands the entire time, those dark eyes tracking every movement. When I finished, I backed away slowly. The creature sat up, a movement that took obvious effort, and looked down at its leg, then back at me. It made a sound I can only describe as acknowledgement, not quite a grunt, not quite a word.
Then it stood, balancing on one leg, and hobbled into the forest, using trees for support. I didn't expect to see it again. But 3 days later, I found a freshly killed marmot on my porch. No note, no explanation, just a marmot, cleanly killed, still warm. I looked out into the tree line and saw nothing, but I knew it was watching. That was how it started. Over the next 2 years, the pattern continued. I'd leave food scraps at the edge of the clearing, apple cores, bread crusts, leftover rice and dal. They'd be gone by morning. Sometimes I'd find things in return, fish from the stream, wild mushrooms, once a whole baral haunch that kept me fed for 2 weeks. I never saw the creature clearly during those first years, just glimpses, a shape moving between trees at dusk, a massive silhouette against the moonlight, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. But I knew it was there, watching, learning about me the same way I was trying to understand it. In the spring of 1975, I was chopping wood behind the lodge when I felt that familiar sensation, the weight of being observed. I turned slowly, and there it was, standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 20 meters away in full daylight. It was taller than I'd realized during our first encounter. I'd estimate 2.3 meters, maybe more. The injured leg had healed, though it still favored the other one slightly. Its face was weathered, with silver-gray hair mixed into the reddish-brown around its muzzle and chest. We stared at each other for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then I did something crazy. I raised my hand in a wave. The creature tilted its head, considering this gesture. Then, slowly, deliberately, it raised its own massive hand and mimicked the movement. That's when I knew this was going to be something bigger than I ever imagined. By 1976, the creature and I had developed what I can only call a routine.
Not quite a friendship, that word implies too much familiarity, but a careful mutual understanding. It would appear every few weeks, always at dusk or dawn, always keeping a respectful distance. I started calling it Chomolungma in my mind, the Tibetan name for Mount Everest, meaning Mother of the World, because that's when our arrangement truly began to solidify. But the name felt too formal, too distant. Eventually, I shortened it to simply Chomo. That summer, I bought a Polaroid one-step camera during a supply trip to Kathmandu. The shopkeeper, a young Nepali man with a friendly smile, wrapped it carefully while Hindi film music played on a radio in the background. I told him I wanted to photograph the mountains. He suggested I try the new Kodak instead, better for landscape shots. I stuck with the Polaroid. Something told me I'd need instant proof of what I was seeing, even if I never showed anyone. I never used it. Every time I thought about photographing Chomo, something stopped me. Maybe it was respect, maybe it was fear that having proof would ruin the strange sanctuary we'd built. The few grainy photos that existed of Yetis had brought nothing but ridicule and conspiracy theories. I didn't need that kind of attention. Instead, I started keeping a journal, a leather-bound notebook I'd bought in Thamel. I documented everything: dates, times, behaviors, observations. I still have those journals, 12 of them now, stacked in a box at my flat in London. Chomo's intelligence became more apparent with each encounter. In September of 1976, I was working on replacing some rotted boards on the lodge's front steps. I'd set my hammer down to measure a piece of wood, and when I turned back, the hammer was gone. I looked up to see Chomo standing 10 meters away, holding the hammer, examining it with the kind of focused curiosity a child shows when handed something new. I held out my hand, palm up. Chomo studied me for a long moment, then walked forward, closer than it had ever come, and placed the hammer in my hand. Its palm was rough, calloused, like someone who'd worked hard labor their whole life. The fingers were warm. We stood there, maybe 3 meters apart, and I got my first real look at its face in clear light. The eyes were more human than ape, deep brown with flecks of amber set under a prominent brow ridge. The nose was broad and flat, the lips dark and expressive. There were scars on its face, old ones, the kind you accumulate over decades of living in the wild. "Thank you," I said, even though I didn't think it understood English.
Chomo made a sound, a soft rumble from deep in its chest, and touched its own chest with one finger, then pointed at me. It took me a moment to understand. It was asking my name. "James," I said, touching my chest. "James." Chomo's mouth moved, trying to form the shape, but no sound came out that resembled speech. Instead, it made a different sound, 2 quick grunts, almost like Cho-mo, and touched its chest again. I understood. It was giving me permission to name it, or perhaps telling me it already had a name I couldn't pronounce. Either way, Chomo stuck. The late 70s were strange years for the world. Indira Gandhi's emergency had just ended in India. Carter was president in America, and everyone seemed uncertain about everything. I'd catch snippets on the BBC World Service during my evenings at the lodge. Rise in oil prices, political upheaval, the Cold War tensions. I'd make my monthly trek to Kathmandu for supplies, hearing Western music drifting from the tourist restaurants in Tamil. But up in the mountains, time moved differently. Chomo and I existed in a bubble separate from disco and politics and the modern world.
We were building our own language, our own understanding. By 1978, Chomo would sometimes sit on the far side of the clearing while I worked, just sit, watching, sometimes for hours. I'd talk to Chomo about Sarah mostly, about the life I'd left behind, about loneliness. I don't think Chomo understood the words, but it seemed to understand the meaning behind them. Sometimes it would make soft sounds in response, almost like it was trying to comfort me. That's when I started noticing the first lesson. One afternoon in June of 1979, I was trying to fix my small generator. I'd been at it for 2 hours, getting more and more frustrated, cursing and throwing tools. Chomo was sitting at its usual spot, watching. When I finally gave up and stomped back towards the lodge, Chomo stood and walked to the generator. I watched as it picked up the tool I'd been using, a screwdriver, and examined it. Then it looked at the generator, tilted its head, and tried the same thing I'd been attempting, removing a panel cover. But Chomo did it slowly, carefully, without force, and the screw turned. I walked back over. Chomo handed me the screwdriver and stepped back.
Patience, I said aloud, understanding the lesson. You're telling me I need patience. Chomo made that rumbling sound again, the one I'd come to recognize as approval. Over the next year, I've watched Chomo demonstrate patience in dozens of ways. The way it would sit motionless for hours, waiting for fish in the stream. The way it would carefully extract insects from rotten logs, never rushing, never forcing. The way it would watch the forest, reading signs I couldn't see, understanding patterns in nature that I'd spent my whole life ignoring. It was teaching me without words, and I was beginning to realize these weren't just lessons about survival. They were lessons about being human. In November of 1979, I made a mistake that almost cost me everything. I'd trekked down to the village for supplies and stopped at the local Chong house, a dark little place that smelled like fermented millet and wood smoke. I'd had a few too many cups, got to talking with some Western trekkers about the mountains, and stupidly mentioned seeing something unusual on my property. "Unusual how?" asked an American, probably mid-30s, wearing expensive North Face gear. "Just large tracks, strange behavior in the wildlife." I backpedaled, realizing my error. But the American's eyes lit up. "Yeti tracks? Jesus, mate, you serious?" Word spread fast in small villages. Within a week, I had a group of Western trekkers show up near my lodge, cameras ready, talking about becoming famous. I ran them off, told him I'd been drunk and making up stories. They left, but the damage was done. I'd put Chomo in danger because I couldn't keep my mouth shut. I didn't see Chomo for 2 months after that. December and January passed with no sign, no tracks, no gifts of food. I thought I'd lost it forever, that the noise and presence of those trekkers had driven it away permanently. Then, on a February morning in 1980, I woke to find Chomo sitting on my porch, not near the porch, on it, maybe 2 meters from my front door. I opened the door slowly, carefully. Chomo looked at me with those deep brown eyes, and I swear I saw something like forgiveness in them, or maybe understanding that humans make mistakes. Chomo reached into the thick fur on its side and pulled out something small, held it out to me. I stepped forward and took it. A smooth river stone, perfectly round, the size of a rupee coin, warm from being kept close to its body. A gift, an acceptance. I sat down on the porch step, and Chomo sat beside me, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from its massive body.
We sat there for maybe 20 minutes, watching the sun come up over Langtang Lirung, neither of us making a sound. That's when I understood the second lesson. Forgiveness is a choice, not a feeling. Chomo had every reason to disappear forever, to see humans as nothing but threats, but it chose to come back. It chose to trust again, despite everything. I cried that morning right there on the porch, first time since Sarah's funeral. Chomo didn't move, didn't react, just sat with me while I worked through 50 years of accumulated grief. When I finally looked up, Chomo was holding out one massive hand, palm up, an invitation. I placed my hand in its palm, and Chomo's fingers closed gently around it. We sat like that, man and creature, both scarred, both lonely, both trying to understand what connection means until the sun cleared the mountains. That was the moment our relationship changed from observation to something deeper, something I still don't have the right words for, even now, 45 years later. The 80s brought change everywhere except my mountain. Thatcher and Reagan were in power. MTV launched in '81, and suddenly every young trekker passing through was wearing neon and headbands. I'd see it when I made my monthly supply runs to Kathmandu, the world getting faster and louder, but Chomo remained constant. By 1981, our meetings had become more frequent, sometimes twice a week. Chomo had begun bringing me things I didn't understand at first. Arrangements of stones, carefully constructed piles of sticks, once a perfect circle of pine cones in the clearing. I documented everything in my journals, sketching the patterns, trying to decode meaning. It was a Sherpa guide named Pemba who accidentally helped me understand. Pemba would stop by occasionally, checking on me. In March of '82, he showed me something his daughter had made in school, an art project using found objects from nature.
That's when it clicked. Chomo wasn't leaving random arrangements. It was creating art. The next time Chomo appeared, a cool April evening with fog rolling through the trees, I tried something new. I gathered stones from the stream and arranged them in a spiral pattern on a flat rock. Then I stepped back and waited. Chomo emerged from the tree line, approached the stones and studied them for several minutes. Then it looked at me, and I swear it smiled. Not a human smile, but something in the eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before. Chomo sat down and began rearranging the stones into a different pattern, a circle with radiating lines like a child's drawing of the sun. When it finished, it looked at me expectantly. "I see it," I laughed. "It's beautiful." Chomo made that rumbling approval sound and added one more stone to the center. That became our new form of communication, not words, but shared creation. I'd make something, Chomo would modify it or create a response. We were having conversations through art, through symbols neither of us fully understood, but both recognized as meaningful. In July of 1982, something happened that taught me the third lesson, one that shook my understanding of human nature. I'd trekked down to Kathmandu for supplies and stopped at a shop on Freak Street. While buying provisions, I witnessed an argument between a father and his son in the street. The boy was maybe 10, had dropped a basket of vegetables, and the father was berating him, loud, angry, calling him stupid and clumsy in the Pali. The boy was trying not to cry, apologizing over and over. I didn't intervene, none of my business, I told myself,
but it bothered me the whole trek back. 2 days later, Chomo appeared at the clearing while I was splitting wood. It watched me work for a while, then approached closer than usual, maybe 5 meters. It picked up a piece of wood I'd split poorly, jagged and uneven, and held it up to show me. Then Chomo took another piece, one I'd split cleanly, and held them side by side.
I thought it was critiquing my work, maybe showing me the difference in quality. But then Chomo did something unexpected. It placed both pieces together carefully, gently, as if the poor cut and the good cut were equally valuable. It made a soft sound and touched its chest, then pointed to both pieces of wood. The message hit me like cold water. Both pieces were still wood. Both had value. One wasn't stupid or worthless because it wasn't perfect. "You're talking about that boy," I said aloud, even though Chomo couldn't have known about the street incident. "You're saying we're too hard on each other, too." Chomo set the wood down and made a gesture I'd seen before, touching its eyes, then sweeping its hand toward the forest. "Look, observe, understand." I realized Chomo had been watching humans probably decades, maybe longer, not just me. Trekkers, climbers, local villagers passing through these mountains. It had observed us the way Jane Goodall observed chimps, studying our behaviors, our cruelty and kindness, our contradictions, and Chomo had drawn conclusions. Over the next few years, Chomo showed me more. In 1983, it led me to a spot about 2 kilometers from the lodge where some trekkers had dumped rubbish, old tins, plastic bags, a broken cooking pot. Chomo stood there gesturing at the mess, then at the pristine forest around us. The comparison was obvious. Disgust was evident in its body language. "We're destructive," I said. "We don't respect what we have." Chomo touched its chest again, then touched a tree trunk, then the ground. The message, "I'm part of this. You are separate from it." That was lesson 4. Humans had forgotten we're part of nature, not above it. In monsoon season in 1985, I remember because We Are the World was everywhere on the BBC World Service, and I'd bought a battery-powered cassette player for the lodge. Chomo showed me something that changed everything. It brought another creature to the clearing. I was inside making tea when I heard an unusual sound. 2 distinct vocalizations. One I recognized as Chomo, another higher pitched. I grabbed my walking stick out of habit and looked out the window. Chomo stood at the clearing's edge with a smaller version of itself. Not a child. This one was adult-sized, maybe 2 meters tall, with darker, almost black fur. Female, I guessed, though I had no real way to know. Chomo gestured for me to come out, but slowly, carefully. I set down the stick and stepped onto the porch with my hands visible and empty. The 2 creatures watched me. Chomo made a series of soft sounds to its companion, communication I couldn't decipher, but recognized as complex. The female remained behind Chomo, cautious but curious. Chomo walked forward alone, picked up a stick, and drew a simple shape in the dirt. 2 tall figures, one smaller one between them. Then Chomo pointed at the female, at itself, and swept its hand toward the mountains. Family. Chomo was showing me it had family. The female never came close that day. Maybe after 10 minutes she retreated into the forest, but Chomo stayed, and I understood what had just happened. Chomo had brought its mate, or sibling, or friend, I never knew for certain, to see me, to prove to her that not all humans were dangerous. That was lesson 5. Trust is the most precious thing any creature can offer, and betraying it destroys more than just a relationship.
It destroys the possibility of connection. I never saw the female again. I don't know if she died, left, or simply chose to remain hidden. But that encounter made me realize Chomo's loneliness probably mirrored my own. We were both isolated from our kind, both seeking something we couldn't find in our own species. In 1987, I was 59 years old. My hair had gone completely gray, my hands had developed arthritis, and I'd started wearing reading glasses from a shop in Kathmandu to write in my journals. Chomo looked older too, more silver in its fur, a slight stoop in its posture, movements a bit slower. One evening in late September, Chomo and I sat on opposite sides of the clearing as the sun set over the peaks. I was reading a week-old newspaper from Kathmandu, something about the stock market crash. Black Monday, they called it. Everyone losing money, panicking about the future. Chomo made a questioning sound. I looked up to find it gesturing at the newspaper, then at me with what I can only describe as confusion. Money, I tried to explain. People are upset because they lost money.
Chomo tilted its head, clearly not understanding. I thought about how to explain it. We use these paper pieces to trade for things we need: food, shelter, tools. Chomo stood up, walked to the edge of the forest, and returned with a freshly caught trout. It held up the fish, then gestured at the forest around us, trees, water, sky, and made a sweeping motion with his arms. The meaning was clear. Why do you need paper when everything you need is here? I couldn't answer that. I had no good answer. Chomo set the fish down between us, a gift like always, and looked at me with something like pity. That's when I understood lesson 6, maybe the most important one. Humans had created elaborate systems of value that separated us from what actually sustains us. We'd convinced ourselves that abstract concepts like money and status were more important than food, water, shelter, connection. We'd made our lives incredibly complicated, and Chomo couldn't understand why. Neither, sitting there in the fading light with arthritis in my hands and a decade of isolation behind me, could I. The late 80s rolled into the 90s, and the world felt like it was accelerating beyond recognition. The Berlin Wall came down in '89. I heard about it on my shortwave radio. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Gulf War happened. Everything was changing, shifting, the old world order dissolving. But my life remained simple: the lodge, the forest, and Chomo. In the spring of 1990, I turned 62. My body reminded me of it constantly. Bad knees from years of trekking steep terrain, a persistent cough from too many winters breathing wood smoke, hearing that wasn't what it used to be. I'd started thinking about mortality in a way I hadn't since Sarah died. Chomo was aging too. I estimated it was somewhere in its 50s or 60s, though I had no real way to know. Its movements had become more deliberate, careful. The silver in its fur had spread across most of its chest and face. We were two old creatures meeting in the woods, both aware our time was limited. That awareness changed things between us. In June of 1990, Chomo did something it had never done before. It entered the lodge. I'd left the door open on a warm afternoon, was inside organizing supplies I'd bought in Kathmandu. I heard heavy footsteps on the porch and turned to see Chomo's massive frame filling the doorway, having to duck to avoid hitting its head on the frame. We stared at each other. This was a boundary we'd never crossed. The lodge was my space. The forest was Chomo's. But now Chomo was standing in my kitchen, looking around with obvious curiosity. It approached my small table where I'd been sorting through old photographs, pictures of Sarah, my parents, our wedding day in 1950. Chomo picked up the wedding photo carefully, holding it in its enormous hands, studying Sarah's face with intense focus. "That's Sarah," I said quietly. "My wife. She died a long time ago." Chomo looked from the photo to me, back to the photo. Then it did something that still brings tears to my eyes when I think about it. Chomo touched Sarah's face in the photograph with one finger, gentle, reverent, then touched my face the same way. The gesture was unmistakable. It understood loss. It understood grief. It was telling me it knew what I'd been carrying all these years. I broke down, sat right there at my kitchen table and sobbed while this creature that most people thought was a myth stood beside me, one massive hand resting lightly on my shoulder. When I finally composed myself, Chomo carefully placed the photograph back on the table and picked up another one, a picture of me and 3 other engineers from London circa 1968. Chomo studied it, paying particular attention to how close we were standing, arms around each other's shoulders, all of us laughing. Then Chomo made a sound I'd never heard before, something between a sigh and a question, and gestured at the forest, then back at itself, alone. "You miss them too," I said. "Your family, your people." Chomo's response was to gather all the photographs showing me with other people and arrange them in a line on the table. Then it pointed at each person, then at the empty lodge around us, and finally at itself in the forest. Lesson 7 hit me hard. Humans need each other, but we keep choosing isolation. We build walls, create distance, convince ourselves we're better off alone, but we're not. We're dying inside, just like Chomo was, just like I was. We were both proof that isolation, even chosen isolation, was a kind of slow death.
After that day, Chomo came inside the lodge regularly. Not every visit, but often enough that I started keeping a sturdy bench by the door that could support its weight, reinforced with extra timber. We'd sit together in the main room, Chomo examining my books, my tools, my radio with fascination. In November of 1991, I bought a Polaroid camera in Kathmandu, a newer model, the Spectra system, on sale. I'd resisted for years, but I was 63 now, and the thought of dying without any proof of Chomo's existence bothered me more than it used to. When I showed Chomo the camera during its next visit, it recoiled initially, suspicious of the strange device, but I took a photo of the lodge interior and showed it the developing picture. Chomo watched in amazement as the image appeared, then wanted to see more. I took 3 photos that day. One of Chomo sitting in the doorway, backlit by afternoon sun. One of its hand next to mine for scale. One of us both sitting side by side on the porch, taken with the camera timer. I still have those photos. They're locked in a safe deposit box at Barclays in London, along with my journals, evidence I've never shown anyone until now. Chomo became fascinated with the concept of photographs, of capturing moments, preserving memory. It would point at old photos and then at the forest, as if asking why I didn't photograph the trees, the stream, the mountains. I guess I never thought they needed preserving, I admitted. They're always there. Chomo shook its head, a gesture it had learned from watching me, and led me outside. For the next hour, it showed me things I'd walked past 1,000 times without really seeing. A spider's web jeweled with morning dew, the pattern of lichen on a boulder, the way light filtered through the canopy at a specific angle. Lesson 8. We photograph people because we know we'll lose them, but we ignore the world around us because we assume it's permanent. Nothing is permanent. Everything deserves attention, appreciation, remembrance.
By 1992, I'd been meeting Chomo for 19 years. The world had continued its frantic evolution. The internet was becoming a thing people talked about. Mobile phones were getting smaller. Everyone was reading about email. But none of that touched us in the mountains. What did affect us was the increasing presence of trekkers and tourists. The Langtang region was becoming popular with adventurers from Kathmandu and beyond. People with brand new REI gear and expensive cameras looking for adventure. In July of '92, a group of young trekkers camped about 3 kilometers from my lodge. I heard them before I saw them. Loud music from a portable speaker, laughter, the sound of celebration. They stayed for 3 days, left behind a mess of rubbish, and carved their initials into several rhododendron trees. Chomo showed up the day after they left, more agitated than I'd ever seen it. It led me to the campsite and stood there, gesturing at the damage, making distressed sounds I'd never heard before. The carved trees seemed to upset it most. Deep gouges in the bark that would take years to heal, if they healed at all. I tried to explain. They're young, they don't think about consequences. But Chomo wasn't buying it. It picked up a plastic bottle and crushed it in one hand, then threw it at the ground in what I can only describe as disgust. Then it did something calculated. It walked to a tree, raised its hand as if to gouge the bark, but stopped centimeters away. It looked at me, making sure I was watching, then gently touched the tree instead, almost caressing it. The message, the choice to harm or not harm, is conscious. Those trekkers knew what they were doing, they just didn't care. Lesson 9. Cruelty and thoughtlessness aren't signs of youth or ignorance, they're choices, and humans choose destruction far more often than we choose preservation. That was the beginning of a darker period in our relationship. Chomo was seeing more human activity in the forest, and none of it was good. Rubbish, vandalism, poaching, noise pollution. It was watching its world being invaded, and it couldn't understand why we were so determined to ruin everything we touched. I couldn't explain it because I didn't understand it either. In 1994, something happened that nearly ended everything. A development company bought land 8 kilometers south of my property and started construction on a large trekking resort. The sound of machinery echoed through the mountains for months. The stream ran muddy with runoff. Animals I'd seen regularly for years disappeared. Chomo came to the lodge in March of that year, looking different. Not just upset, but something deeper. Defeated. It sat on the porch, and for the first time since I'd known it, Chomo looked old. Not just aged, but worn down, broken. I sat beside it, and we listened to the distant sound of construction. "I'm sorry," I said, though the words felt worthless. "We're a destructive species. We can't seem to help ourselves." Chomo turned to look at me with eyes that held something I'd never seen before. Judgment. For the first time in 21 years, Chomo was looking at me not as an individual, but as a representative of humanity, and humanity was found wanting. Chomo stood, walked to the edge of the clearing, and didn't look back. It just disappeared into the forest. I didn't see it again for 8 months. The silence of those 8 months was worse than the loneliness after Sarah died. At least with Sarah, I'd had memories, photographs, the certainty that what we'd shared was real. With Chomo, I started questioning everything. Had I imagined the depth of our connection? Had I projected human emotions onto a creature that was simply tolerating me? I was 66 years old, living alone in the mountains, spending time with something most people believed was folklore. Maybe I'd lost my mind years ago and just hadn't noticed. Winter of 1994 into 1995 was brutal. Heavy snows, temperatures dropping well below freezing, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. I spent most of January and February inside, burning through my wood supply, listening to the BBC to remind myself that other humans still existed. The construction stopped in late February, too much snow, ground too frozen. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a wound, of something broken that couldn't be fixed. March brought a thaw, and with it, Chomo.
I was hauling water from the stream on a gray morning when I saw it standing at the far edge of the clearing, thinner than I remembered, fur matted in places, moving with obvious stiffness. We stared at each other across 20 meters of muddy ground. I set down the water buckets and waited. Chomo approached slowly, stopping about 6 meters away, close enough for me to see new scars on its face and arms, close enough to see how much those 8 months had aged it, how much they'd aged both of us. "I didn't think you'd come back," I said. Chomo made a low sound, not quite the rumble of approval I knew, something sadder. It gestured at the forest around us, then at itself, then at me. Then it touched its chest over its heart and held up one finger. One, alone, the same. "Yeah," I said, my voice breaking. "We're the same, both of us watching our worlds disappear." Chomo sat down heavily, and I sat too, ignoring the cold mud soaking through my trousers. We sat like that for maybe an hour, two old creatures who'd somehow found each other and didn't know how to let go. Finally, Chomo stood and gestured for me to follow. It led me deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone, to a spot about 5 kilometers from the lodge where the construction had stopped. The contrast was stark. On one side, ancient forest, cathedral quiet and alive. On the other, a half-built structure of concrete and metal, abandoned for the winter. Chomo stood at the boundary between the two worlds and touched a massive rhododendron that had been spared by maybe 15 meters. The tree was old, probably 200 years or more, its trunk thick with moss and lichen. Then Chomo walked across the boundary into the construction site and touched a stump, same size as the living tree, probably the same age, cut down and hauled away to make room for luxury lodges. Chomo looked at me, and I understood lesson 10, maybe the most important one Chomo had been trying to teach me all along. Humans measure value by what we can extract, consume, profit from. We don't see the intrinsic worth of existence itself. That tree had survived 200 years of monsoons, earthquakes, harsh winters, only to be reduced to timber because we needed luxury accommodations.
"We're afraid," I said aloud, trying to make sense of it. Afraid of not having enough, of not being enough. So we take and take, thinking it'll fill whatever's empty inside us. Chomo made a sound I'd never heard before, something between a growl and a keen, raw and painful. Then it did something that broke my heart. Chomo sat down in the construction site, surrounded by devastation, and put its head in its hands. It was grieving, not just for the trees, but for everything, for its lost family, for the shrinking forest, for the impossibility of stopping what was coming. I sat beside Chomo in the mud and concrete dust, and we grieved together. Our meetings after that day took on a different quality, less teaching, more companionship. We were two survivors clinging to something that couldn't last, both knowing it but unwilling to admit it. In the summer in 1996, I had a health scare, a small heart attack that landed me in a clinic in Kathmandu for 4 days. When I got back to the lodge, Chomo was waiting on the porch. It knew somehow. Maybe it had come by while I was gone, found the lodge empty, sensed something was wrong. Chomo examined me carefully, touched my chest gently where I assumed it could feel my heartbeat. Then it did something extraordinary. It lay down on the porch and positioned itself so I could lean against it, using its body as a backrest. We stayed like that for hours, Chomo's warmth and steady breathing keeping me grounded. That's when I understood the final lesson, lesson 11. The greatest thing any creature can offer another is simple presence, not solutions, not wisdom, not even hope, just the willingness to stay, to be there, to witness each other's existence without trying to fix what can't be fixed. By 1997, I was 69, and Chomo was visibly failing. Its movements were slow, labored. The silver in its fur had split completely, and there was a wheeze in its breathing I didn't like. I was failing too. 2 more small heart episodes, arthritis so bad some mornings I could barely make a fist, hearing mostly gone in my left ear. We were running out of time, and we both knew it.
Chomo's visits became less frequent, every few weeks instead of weekly, then once a month. When it did come, we didn't do much. Sometimes we'd sit in silence. Sometimes I'd read aloud from books, even though Chomo couldn't understand the words. Sometimes we'd walk slowly through the forest, 2 old friends saying goodbye to a world we'd shared. In September of 1997, Chomo brought me something it had never offered me before, a tuft of its own fur, carefully pulled and twisted into a small bundle. It placed it in my hand and closed my fingers around it. A keepsake, a memory, a way to prove, if only to myself, that this had all been real. "Thank you," I whispered, "for everything, for teaching me, for seeing me when I didn't want to be seen." Chomo touched my face with one massive hand, gentle as a whisper, and made that rumbling sound one last time. The last time I saw Chomo was March 15th, 1998. I remember the date because it was exactly 25 years after our first encounter. I woke that morning to find Chomo sitting on the porch, backlit by dawn. It looked terrible, emaciated, fur patchy, breathing shallow. It had come to say goodbye. I sat beside it, and we watched the sunrise together one final time. The forest was waking up around us, birds singing, a bahral moving through the underbrush, the stream rushing with snowmelt, all the life we'd witnessed together for a quarter century. Chomo reached over and took my hand, held it in both of its massive palms.
We sat like that until the sun cleared the mountains. Then Chomo stood, slower than I'd ever seen it move, and walked toward the tree line. At the edge of the clearing, it turned back one last time. It raised one hand, not a wave, more like a benediction, and then it was gone. I never saw Chomo again. I searched for months afterward, found no body, no sign, no evidence beyond the memories in the tuft of fur I kept in a small wooden box. Maybe Chomo had gone deep into the forest to die alone, the way many animals do. Maybe it had simply walked until it couldn't walk anymore. I'm 97 years old now. I left the lodge in 2003 when my health finally forced me back to London. The lodge is still there, fallen apart, reclaimed by the forest. The property is in a conservation trust now. It'll never be developed or logged. People ask me why I'm telling this story now, why I waited so long. The truth is, I wasn't waiting. I was processing, trying to understand what Chomo taught me over those 25 years. Here's what I learned, what I think Chomo was trying to show me about humans. We've forgotten how to be present. We're always rushing, always consuming, always taking, never just being. We judge each other brutally, but we're all just trying to survive, all carrying wounds we don't show. We've separated ourselves from nature and called it progress, built complexity and called it civilization, created abstractions and called them more valuable than the real things they represent. We're capable of profound connection, but we choose isolation. We're capable of preservation, but we choose destruction. We're capable of wisdom, but we choose convenience. And yet, and this is important, we're also capable of change, of choosing differently, of seeing the world through different eyes if we're willing to sit still long enough, be quiet enough, humble enough to learn from something we don't understand. Chomo didn't hate humans. If it had, it never would have returned after those trekkers came, never would have spent 25 years teaching a stubborn old man how to see. Chomo just wished we were better, kinder, more aware, more connected to what actually matters. I wish that too. The tuft of fur is still in my bedside table. Sometimes when my flat is quiet and I can't sleep, I take it out and remember. Remember sitting in the forest with something impossible. Remember being seen, fully seen, by eyes that held no judgment, only curiosity and sadness and hope.
If you take anything from this story, take this. Slow down. Look around. See the world. Really see it before it's gone. Connect with someone different from you. Learn that value isn't about what you can extract or consume. And if you're ever in the Himalayas, in the deep forest where the old rhododendrons still stand, be quiet, be respectful, be open, because maybe, just maybe, something's watching. Something that's been observing us far longer than we've been looking for it. Something that knows what we are, what we could be, and what we're choosing to become. Chomo taught me that the biggest mystery isn't whether the Yeti exists. It's why we, despite all our intelligence and technology and supposed superiority,
are so determined to destroy the only home we've ever known? I'm 97 years old, and I still don't have an answer to that question.